The wind was strong on the Dakota plains that morning. The sun rose slowly, painting the tall grass with gold. Buffalo moved in the distance, dark shapes against the bright horizon. In a small Lakota camp by the Grand River, a child was born. A boy who would one day stand against an empire. His people called him Tatanka Iyotake. In English, it means buffalo bull who sits down. To the world, he would become known as Sitting Bull. He was born around the year 1831, a time when the Lakota Sioux lived freely across the vast plains. The land was rich with buffalo, the air filled with songs, drums, and laughter. For the Lakota, life was about harmony, with the land, with the animals, and with the Great Spirit. From the start, Tatanka Iyotake was different. He was calm, thoughtful, and slow to speak. Other children laughed and shouted, but he would sit quietly, watching. His father, Returns Again, was a respected warrior, known for his bravery and wisdom. His mother, her holy door woman, carried deep strength and kindness. When he was small, his father gave him a tiny bow and said, "A warrior must learn not only to fight, but to think." Those words would guide him all his life. As a boy, Tatanka Iyotake loved to ride horses. He could stay on the back of a galloping pony without fear. He practiced shooting arrows from horseback, learning to hit his target while the world rushed by. By the time he was 10, he could already ride and shoot better than most grown men. But he was not only a hunter, he was a dreamer. At night, he would lie under the stars and listen to the stories of the elders. They told tales of the Great Spirit, the sacred buffalo, and the balance of life. Sitting Bull listened closely. He understood that power did not come from anger. It came from wisdom, from patience, and from love for one's people. By the age of 14, he joined his first raid. It was a test of courage, a way for young men to prove themselves. The Lakota rode against the Crow, a rival tribe. Arrows filled the air. Dust rose from pounding hooves. In the middle of the chaos, young Tatanka Iyotake saw an enemy warrior charging straight at him. Without fear, he aimed his bow and struck. The warrior fell. That day, he earned his place as a man. His father was proud. The tribe held a feast, and from that moment, they began to call him Sitting Bull, a name that would echo across the land. He grew into a strong, broad-shouldered man, but his strength was not just physical. He had a quiet power that drew people to him. When others fought out of pride, he fought out of purpose. He believed every action should honor the ancestors and protect the generations to come. In the years that followed, life for the Lakota began to change. White settlers started moving west. They built forts and roads across native lands. They hunted buffalo for sport, leaving carcasses to rot in the sun. The Lakota watched the herds, once endless, begin to vanish. Sitting Bull saw this change with heavy eyes. He warned his people, "If we do not stand together, the white man will take our land, our freedom, and our spirits." But for now, he still had hope. He believed that if his people remained strong, the Great Spirit would protect them. As a young leader, Sitting Bull became known not only for his courage, but for his kindness. When the poor were hungry, he gave them food. When the weak were afraid, he gave them strength. He was not a man who sought glory, he sought balance. He often said, "The earth is our mother. Whatever befalls the earth, befalls the sons of the earth." Those words carried deep meaning, words that would later become his message to the entire world. In his 20s, he took part in many battles to defend his people's hunting grounds. The Lakota were fierce warriors, and Sitting Bull was often at the front lines. Yet even in battle, he refused to kill out of hatred. "A warrior," he said, "fights for his people, not for blood." As his fame spread among the tribes, so did his sense of responsibility. He began to fast and pray, spending days alone on the hills. He sought visions from the Great Spirit. Sometimes he would sit for hours in silence, watching the wind move through the grass, feeling the heartbeat of the earth beneath him. It was during these times that his people began to see him not just as a warrior, but as a holy man. He spoke of peace, but he also spoke of resistance. He warned that the time would come when the Lakota would be forced to defend everything they held sacred, and that time came sooner than anyone expected. One day, word spread that white explorers had found gold in the Black Hills, a place the Lakota considered sacred. The U.S. government had promised, through the Treaty of Fort Laramie, that the Black Hills would belong to the Lakota forever. But forever soon meant nothing. Miners flooded the land. Soldiers followed. They built roads and forts, cutting into the heart of Lakota territory. The buffalo herds disappeared faster than ever. Sitting Bull saw what was happening. He saw the greed, the lies, the hunger for land. And in his heart, he knew the truth. This was not just about gold, it was about survival. He gathered his people and said, "I will not sell my birthright. I will not give away the earth from which I was born." Those words marked the beginning of a new chapter, a chapter of resistance, of unity, and of destiny. Sitting Bull was no longer just a man. He was becoming a symbol, a voice for every tribe that refused to bow. The boy who once watched the horizon in silence now stood at the center of history, ready to face the storm that was coming. The winds of change swept across the plains. What was once peaceful land, filled with songs of the Lakota, now echoed with the sound of hammers, gunfire, and marching boots. The year was 1868. The Lakota, the Cheyenne, and the Arapaho had signed the Treaty of Fort Laramie with the United States. The treaty promised that the Black Hills, sacred land to the Lakota, would belong to them forever. It was written, sealed, and sworn, but words on paper could not stop greed. In 1874, gold was discovered in those same Black Hills. The news spread like wildfire. Thousands of white settlers rushed west, their wagons carving scars into the earth. Soldiers followed to protect them. Camps turned into towns. Towns turned into cities. The Lakota watched in disbelief. "This land is ours," they said. "You made a promise." But the promise meant nothing. The U.S. government sent men to buy the land, to pay the Lakota to leave their home. Sitting Bull refused. He looked at the officials and said calmly, "I will not sell even one handful of this earth. The Black Hills are part of me. You might as well sell the sky." His words carried the power of mountains. Sitting Bull had seen enough lies, enough broken treaties, enough empty promises. He knew that peace built on betrayal could not last. He gathered his people and said, "The Great Spirit made this land for us. We were born here, we will die here. No paper can take that away." As more soldiers arrived, tension grew. The buffalo, once in endless numbers, were slaughtered for sport. Hunters left their bodies to rot in the sun. The Lakota depended on the buffalo for food, clothing, shelter, for life itself. Without them, starvation crept closer each season. The elders prayed. The mothers wept, and Sitting Bull's heart grew heavy. He would walk alone at night, listening to the wind move through the empty grass. In that silence, he would speak to the Great Spirit. "Why must my people suffer?" he would ask. "What must I do?" The answer came not in words, but in feeling. A quiet strength, a knowing that he must stand firm. He became more than a chief. He became the heart of his people. Sitting Bull called for unity. He sent word to the Lakota, the Cheyenne, and the Arapaho, to all who wished to remain free. He said, "If we stand alone, we will fall. If we stand together, we will live." Many answered his call. Warriors gathered from across the plains. Around their campfires, they spoke of freedom, honor, and the promise of the ancestors. In those days, Sitting Bull was not only a warrior, he was a holy man. He led ceremonies, prayed for visions, and fasted to seek guidance. His people believed that the Great Spirit spoke through him. During one of these visions, Sitting Bull saw soldiers falling into the Lakota camp, upside down, like grasshoppers dropping from the sky. The vision was powerful and clear. He knew it meant one thing: a great battle was coming. But even with war on the horizon, he did not seek blood. He told his people, "Do not strike the first blow. Let them come to us. We fight only to defend our homes." By 1876, the U.S. government had issued an order. All native tribes must move to reservations or be treated as hostile. Sitting Bull refused. His people would not live behind fences. They would not give up their freedom, and so the army came for them. General George Crook moved from the south. Colonel John Gibbon came from the west. And from the east rode Lieutenant Colonel George Armstrong Custer, a man known for his arrogance and ambition. The Lakota gathered in a great camp by the Little Bighorn River. There were families, children, elders, not just warriors. The camp stretched for miles, one of the largest gatherings of native people ever seen. Sitting Bull prayed in the center of the camp. He did not lead with weapons. He led with spirit. He said, "This land is all we have left. If we lose it, we lose ourselves." The women prepared food. The warriors painted their horses. Drums echoed through the night. There was fear, but also pride. They were fighting not for power, but for their right to live free. When the sun rose, Sitting Bull stood on a hill overlooking the valley. He felt the wind brush his face and whispered, "We are ready." Down the river, the soldiers were approaching. They thought the Lakota would scatter. They were wrong. Sitting Bull's people were united, Lakota, Cheyenne, Arapaho, thousands strong. They were led by skilled warriors like Crazy Horse, Gall, and Two Moons. Each one carried the fire of their ancestors in their hearts. The battle that would soon come, the Battle of the Little Bighorn, would not only change history, it would become the story of a people's spirit refusing to die. As the days grew hotter, Sitting Bull continued to pray. He told his people, "I have seen the soldiers fall. I have seen the Great Spirit protect us. We must believe." He looked at the children playing by the river and said softly, "They are why we fight." The storm was coming. The drums beat louder. Horses neighed, warriors sharpened their arrows, and the air filled with tension. No one knew how the battle would unfold, but everyone knew that the time for talking was over. Sitting Bull, once a quiet child who loved the open sky, now stood as the last great protector of his people's way of life. He had no army, no cannons, no walls. He had only faith, faith that the Great Spirit would not let the Lakota vanish into the dust. And as the first smoke rose over the plains, he lifted his pipe to the heavens and whispered, "Great Spirit, give us strength." What came next would become one of the most powerful moments in American history, a story of courage, vision, and resistance that the world would never forget. The summer sun burned over the wide Montana plains. The year was 1876, and the land shimmered like gold. For weeks, the Lakota, the Cheyenne, and the Arapaho had camped by the river they called Greasy Grass. Thousands of teepees lined the valley. Smoke from their fires drifted into the blue sky. The sound of children playing mixed with the low beat of drums. It was a rare moment of peace, families together, free on their own land. But deep inside, everyone knew the peace would not last. For months, Sitting Bull had warned that the U.S. Army would come. He had seen it in his visions, soldiers falling from the sky, their bodies lifeless, their horses running wild. Now that vision was about to come true. At dawn, the camp came alive. Warriors painted their horses in sacred patterns. Some drew white lightning streaks across the animals' necks for speed. Others marked red handprints, the symbol of courage. Old men sang songs of battle, their voices trembling with pride. Mothers tied small charms to their sons' hair for protection. Sitting Bull walked among them, quiet and calm. He carried no weapon, only his pipe. His strength came from spirit, not steel. He looked out across the plains and said softly, "The Great Spirit has shown me what is to come. We must stand strong, not with anger, but with honor." Not far away, Lieutenant Colonel George Armstrong Custer rode with the 7th Cavalry. He was proud, ambitious, and certain of victory. He believed the native people would run at the sight of his men. He did not know he was riding into the greatest mistake of his life. Custer divided his soldiers into smaller groups, a fatal decision. He wanted the glory of capturing the great Sitting Bull himself. As his men advanced, the Lakota scouts saw them. They raced back to camp, shouting, "Soldiers are coming! The Bluecoats are near!" The camp erupted into motion. Warriors grabbed bows, rifles, and spears. Horses thundered across the valley. Women and children moved towards safety as the men prepared to fight. Sitting Bull did not lead the attack. That was not his role. He was the heart, the spirit, the guide. He stood on a hill, lifted his pipe to the sky, and prayed, "Great Spirit, protect my people. Give them courage." Down below, a young leader named Crazy Horse rode into battle. His long hair flowed behind him, and his voice carried through the chaos. "Today is a good day to fight." The two forces collided in a storm of dust and fire. Bullets tore through the air. Arrows rained down like a storm. The sound of war filled the valley. The cries of men, the whinnies of horses, the pounding of drums. Custer's men realized too late that they were surrounded. The Lakota and Cheyenne warriors came from every direction, swift and fearless. The soldiers tried to regroup, but their lines broke. Panic spread. Custer shouted orders, but the noise drowned his voice. Smoke filled his lungs. Horses fell. Men dropped their rifles and ran. From the hilltop, Sitting Bull watched. He remembered his vision, soldiers falling upside down, like grasshoppers from the sky. And as he watched, he saw it unfold before his eyes. Custer and every one of his men were cut down. The battle lasted less than an hour. When it ended, silence spread across the valley. The great vision had come true. The Lakota had won. Warriors danced and sang around the camp. They had defended their home, their families, their way of life. It was a victory not of conquest, but of survival. But Sitting Bull did not celebrate. He stood quietly by the river, looking out at the setting sun. His face was calm, but his heart was heavy. He knew the white men would never forgive this defeat. He knew they would come back, not with hundreds, but with thousands. He turned to his people and said, "Now they will never leave us in peace. This victory will bring a storm greater than any we have known." He was right. News of the defeat spread across the United States like fire. Newspapers screamed headlines, Custer and his men slain. Politicians demanded revenge. Generals swore to crush the Lakota once and for all. The U.S. Army launched a massive campaign. They burned villages, destroyed food supplies, and hunted the tribes across the plains. As winter came, the great camp by the Little Bighorn broke apart. Families fled in different directions, searching for safety. Sitting Bull led his people north, across the border into Canada. The land there was cold, but it was free. For a time, they found peace again. Each morning, Sitting Bull stood on the frozen hills and looked south. He could almost feel the breath of his homeland in the wind. But he knew they could never go back. Not yet. He spoke to his people, reminding them to hold on to hope. The Great Spirit watches over us still. As long as we remember who we are not lost. But life in exile was hard. The buffalo were gone. Food was scarce. Children grew thin, and the elders wept for the land they had left behind. Sitting Bull never wavered. Even in the darkest times, he kept his faith. He told stories by the fire, of bravery, of the battle at Little Bighorn, of how the Great Spirit had given them strength when they needed it most. His people listened, their eyes glowing in the firelight. For them, he was more than a leader. He was a symbol, proof that they were still standing, even when the world tried to erase them. Years later, when they finally returned to the United States, that memory of the victory at the Little Bighorn stayed alive in their hearts. It was the day the Great Spirit spoke through a vision. The day the Lakota stood tall. The day the world learned that the spirit of Sitting Bull and his people could not be broken. The smoke of battle had faded, but the war was not over. The United States burned with anger. Custer was dead, and the country wanted revenge. Soldiers poured into the plains like a flood. They hunted the Lakota, burned their camps, and destroyed their food. Sitting Bull knew what would come. He gathered his people, families, elders, children, and looked to the north. He pointed across the horizon and said, "There is another land beyond this river, a place where the white soldiers cannot follow. There we may find peace." That land was Canada. The journey was long and bitter. The people traveled through storms, across freezing rivers, over endless grass. Mothers carried babies on their backs. Old men leaned on sticks, their feet bleeding in the snow. The buffalo were gone. There was little to eat but dried meat and roots. Still, they kept moving. Sitting Bull rode at the front, silent, steady. He did not complain. He did not rest. He was the spirit that kept them going. After many weeks, they crossed into Canadian land, the land of the Northwest Territories. It was 1877. The wind was colder here, sharper, but the sky was wide and open. For the first time in months, they could breathe without fear. They built a camp near Wood Mountain. The land was quiet. The Canadian soldiers, unlike the Americans, did not attack. They watched from a distance, unsure of what to do with these proud, wounded people. For Sitting Bull, this land was both safety and sorrow. He would walk alone on the hills and stare toward the south, where his homeland waited across the invisible line. His heart ached for the plains, for the rivers, for the songs of the Lakota fires, but he would not let his people see his pain. He told them, "We are free here. The Great Spirit has given us another chance. Be strong. Remember who you are. At first, life in Canada was peaceful. The Lakota hunted what little buffalo remained. They traded with the local tribes and tried to rebuild their lives. Sitting Bull met with the Canadian officers, men in red coats who spoke politely and kept their promises, unlike the Americans. One of them asked him, "Will you not return to your country? You cannot stay here forever." Sitting Bull looked at him and said, "I would rather stay in this cold land and eat grass than go back to a place where my people are slaves." Those words spread far and wide. They carried the weight of truth and pride, but freedom came with a price. The winters were cruel. Snow buried the land for months. The buffalo disappeared completely. The people began to starve. Sitting Bull gave his own food to the children. He would go hungry before letting a child suffer. Sometimes he would sit by the fire, his eyes fixed on the flames, thinking of all he had lost, his home, his friends, his land. But he never gave up hope. He told his followers, "The Great Spirit watches even in the coldest night. We must endure. The snow will melt and the sun will return." He believed that as long as they held on to their dignity, they had not been defeated. But the U.S. Army did not forget. They sent messengers to Canada, urging the government to hand over Sitting Bull. They spread lies, calling him a murderer, a savage, a danger. The Canadian officials refused to arrest him, but they made it clear he could not stay forever. Years passed. One by one, small groups of his people gave up. They were tired, hungry, hopeless. They crossed back into the United States, surrendering in exchange for food and shelter. Sitting Bull watched them go, sadness in his eyes. He understood. He did not blame them. But he refused to surrender. He said, "If I must die here in the snow, I will die a free man." By 1881, the truth was clear. His people were starving. The children were sick. The elders could barely walk. He saw the suffering and knew he could not let it continue. One night, he sat alone under the stars. The cold wind bit his face, but his mind was clear. He thought of his vision years ago, the soldiers falling from the sky. The Great Spirit had spoken then. Perhaps it was time to listen again. He prayed, "Great Spirit, I have done what I can. My people are cold and hungry. If I must bow my head, let it be for them, not for myself." The next morning he gathered his people. His voice was calm, but his heart was heavy. "My children," he said, "the time has come. We will return to our homeland. Not in fear, but in dignity. I will go before you, and we will face whatever waits for us." In the spring of 1881, after 4 long years in exile, Sitting Bull and his remaining followers crossed the border back into the United States. Soldiers waited for them at Fort Buford. When he arrived, he dismounted his horse slowly. He walked toward the soldiers, proud, silent, unbroken. He laid his rifle on the ground and said, "I wish it to be remembered that I was the last man of my tribe to surrender my rifle." There was no fear in his eyes, only strength. The officer nodded, almost with respect. He had never seen a man surrender with such dignity. Sitting Bull's people were sent to a reservation. Their freedom was gone, their land taken, their buffalo extinct. But their spirit, that sacred flame of the Lakota, still burned. Even in defeat, Sitting Bull remained their leader, their teacher, their symbol of hope. He had faced hunger, war, and exile, and still he stood. He told his people, "The white man knows how to make everything, but he does not know how to share. We must never forget how to share, how to love, how to be human." Those words carried across generations. He had lost everything, yet he had kept the one thing that mattered most, the soul of his people. And even though the snow had melted and the buffalo were gone, the legend of Sitting Bull was only beginning. The long road home was cold and silent. When Sitting Bull crossed back into the United States in 1881, he was not returning to freedom. He was returning to captivity. At Fort Buford, he stood before American soldiers with calm dignity. He had led his people across borders and through hunger, but now his hands were empty. Still, his heart was unbroken. "I am the last man of my tribe to surrender my rifle," he said. Those words carried the weight of generations. After his surrender, The U.S. government treated him not as a hero, but as a prisoner. They called him a hostile leader. To them, Sitting Bull was a symbol of rebellion, and symbols they feared most of all. The army kept him under guard. Reporters came from far away just to see him, the man who had defeated Custer. Some expected a savage warrior, but they found a calm, thoughtful man who spoke softly and looked them straight in the eye. One journalist asked him, "Do you regret fighting the white man?" Sitting Bull replied, "I never fought against the white man until they came to kill my people and take our land. What would you have done?" There was no anger in his voice, only truth. After 2 years of imprisonment, Sitting Bull and his followers were sent to the Standing Rock Reservation in Dakota Territory. The land was harsh, dry, and unfamiliar. There were fences, rules, and rations. The people could not hunt freely. Soldiers watched their every move. For a man who had once roamed the open plains, this was a cage. Every sunrise reminded him of what had been lost: the buffalo, the freedom, the laughter of his people before the wars. Yet he refused to live in bitterness. He became a teacher. He told the children stories of the old ways, of bravery, of honor, of the Great Spirit. He reminded them that their blood still carried the fire of their ancestors. "The white man can take our land," he said, "but he cannot take our spirit." He encouraged his people to hold on to their language, their songs, their prayers. While others gave up hope, Sitting Bull kept the flame alive. But the U.S. agents who ran the reservation did not trust him. They feared his influence. They saw him not as a wise elder, but as a threat. They tried to silence him, cutting his food rations, keeping him under constant watch, spreading lies that he was plotting another rebellion. But Sitting Bull never spoke of war again. He spoke only of dignity and peace. Still, his reputation made the authorities uneasy. They could not kill his name, so they tried to control it. Then, in 1885, something unexpected happened. A man named William Buffalo Bill Cody came to see him. Buffalo Bill was famous for his traveling show, Buffalo Bill's Wild West. It was part history, part entertainment, where cowboys and Native Americans acted out battles from the frontier. He invited Sitting Bull to join the show. At first, Sitting Bull refused. He was no performer. But when he saw that joining could help his people earn money and tell their story, he agreed, on his own terms. He was not a clown or a captive. He would appear as himself, the chief who had defended his people. And so, Sitting Bull traveled east, far from the plains, far from home. The crowds were enormous. Tens of thousands came to see him. Some cheered, others stared. They wanted to see the savage chief who killed Custer. Sitting Bull stood tall, wearing his eagle feather headdress and beaded shirt. He did not smile. He waved only once, his face calm and proud. He would later say, "They look at me as if I am a strange animal. They do not see that I am a man." He met presidents, generals, and famous men. Once, he even met President Grover Cleveland. People expected him to ask for favors, but he simply said, "I have nothing to ask from you." The Great Spirit made us both. The show toured across the United States and even into Canada. Sitting Bull watched cities rise from the ground, the smoke, the noise, the endless crowds. He saw the power of the new world, but also its emptiness. At night, after the cheering was done, he would sit alone by the fire. Sometimes he would give his earnings to homeless children. Sometimes he would buy candy and hand it out to the poor. He once said, "The white man has made me very rich, but my heart is still poor." After 4 months on the road, he returned to Standing Rock. The people welcomed him home with songs and tears. To them, he was more than a hero. He was proof that the Lakota spirit still lived. But the reservation had changed. The government agents had grown harsher. They punished anyone who followed Sitting Bull or listened to his words. He tried to live quietly, raising horses and caring for his family. Yet, his every move was watched. The white officials feared his influence more than ever. They could take away his weapons, his horses, even his land, but they could not take the respect his people held for him. Each evening, Sitting Bull would light his pipe, look at the sky, and whisper, "The Great Spirit still watches. My people will rise again." He was growing older, but his mind was sharp, his eyes bright with purpose. And though he did not know it yet, a new movement was rising across the plains, a movement of hope, prayer, and prophecy. A movement that would once again place Sitting Bull at the center of history. It was called the Ghost Dance, and in the coming years, it would bring both light and tragedy to the Lakota people, and seal the final chapter of Sitting Bull's life. The years passed slowly on the Standing Rock Reservation. The once proud Lakota, who had roamed the open plains, now lived behind fences. They were told when to hunt, when to pray, and even when to eat. The land that had once been theirs stretched beyond the horizon, but now it was gone. Sitting Bull watched his people grow weak. The buffalo were gone, the old songs were fading. The children were learning the white man's language in mission schools. The world he had fought to protect was disappearing before his eyes. And yet, even in those dark days, he did not lose hope. He would tell the children, "The Great Spirit has not forgotten us. The earth remembers her children." Then, one winter, word began to spread across the reservations, a whisper that became a fire. It was said that far to the west, in Nevada, a holy man had seen a vision. His name was Wovoka, a Paiute prophet. He claimed that he had spoken with the Great Spirit during an eclipse of the sun. The Great Spirit, he said, promised that one day the earth would heal. The buffalo would return. The dead would rise. The white man's rule would end. There was only one condition: the people must dance. It was called the Ghost Dance. The dance spread like lightning across the reservations. It was not a dance of war, but of hope, a circle of prayer. Men, women, and children joined hands and sang. They danced for hours, for days, until they fell in exhaustion and dreams. Some said they saw visions, great herds of buffalo, ancestors walking the plains, the earth covered once more with life. When the Ghost Dance reached the Lakota, Sitting Bull was curious but cautious. He was old now, his hair streaked with gray, his eyes wise and calm. He listened to the stories. He watched the people dance, their faces shining with faith. The agents on the reservation grew nervous. They saw the crowds, the songs, the unity. They feared that the Ghost Dance was not just a prayer. They thought it was the beginning of another rebellion. Rumors spread quickly. The newspapers called it the Indian Uprising. Politicians whispered Sitting Bull's name with fear. They said, "He is the one behind it. He is planning war." But Sitting Bull never called for war. He told his people, "If this dance brings peace to your hearts, then dance. The Great Spirit hears you." Still, the government saw him as the spark that could ignite the plains once more. In the winter of 1890, officials decided they could not risk it. They sent word to the Indian police, "Arrest Sitting Bull." It was an order that would change history. Before dawn on December 15, 1890, a group of Indian police rode through the cold wind toward Sitting Bull's cabin at Standing Rock. The sky was still dark, the stars fading. Inside, Sitting Bull was asleep. His 2 wives and his son were with him. Outside, the horses snorted in the cold. The police surrounded the house. Their leader, Bullhead, stepped forward and shouted, "Sitting Bull, we have orders to take you." Sitting Bull opened the door slowly. He looked at the men. Some were his own people, forced to serve the U.S. government. His voice was calm. "Why do you come for me?" he asked. Bullhead said, "It is the order of the agent. You must come now." Sitting Bull stood tall. "I will go with you," he said, "but I must first dress myself." He stepped back inside. His wives wept quietly as he put on his leggings, his moccasins, his beaded shirt, and his eagle feather headdress. He was not preparing for arrest. He was preparing for dignity. When he stepped outside, his followers had gathered. Tension filled the air. Some shouted, "You shall not take our chief." One of the policemen grabbed Sitting Bull's arm roughly. Another man shouted. Then, a gunshot. The world exploded in chaos. Warriors and police fired at each other at point-blank range. Horses screamed. Bullets tore through the air, and smoke filled the dawn. Sitting Bull was hit in the chest, then again in the head. He fell to the ground. The man who had defied an empire lay still in the dust. The shooting stopped. The air went silent, except for the cries of his family. Sitting Bull's body was carried back into his cabin. His wives knelt beside him, their tears falling on his face. He was 60 years old. When news of his death spread, the plains wept. Even his enemies felt a heavy silence. The newspapers wrote his name across the front pages. Sitting Bull killed. But the Lakota did not believe he was gone. They said his spirit had returned to the Great Plains, to the rivers, the wind, and the stars. They said he had gone to join the ancestors who danced forever with the buffalo. Only 2 weeks later, the ghost dance would end in blood at Wounded Knee, where hundreds of Lakota, men, women, and children were massacred. It was the final tragedy of a long, painful era, but even as the snow covered their bodies, the songs of the ghost dance did not die. They became whispers in the wind, whispers that said, "We are still here," and Sitting Bull's name lived on, not as a rebel, not as a savage, but as a symbol of freedom, of dignity, of unbroken spirit. He had once said, "I am not a fool. I know that the white man intends to destroy us, but I am a man who loves his people," and he died as he lived, standing for them, proud, fearless, and free. The morning after Sitting Bull's death, the plains were silent. The sun rose pale and cold over the Standing Rock Reservation. The snow glittered like shards of glass, and a thin smoke curled from the teepees where grief hung heavy in the air. Word traveled fast, faster than the wind. The great chief was dead. Mothers cried openly. Warriors stood in silence, their faces hard, their hearts broken. Old men shook their heads and whispered prayers. Sitting Bull, the man who had dreamed of freedom, who had stood unbending before empires, now lay lifeless on the frozen ground. But even in death, his spirit refused to be small. The Lakota women dressed his body with care. They placed eagle feathers in his hair and a peace pipe beside him. His face looked calm, almost as if he were sleeping. They buried him near his cabin, beside the Grand River, the same waters that had seen his birth nearly 60 years before. Some said that, as the earth closed over him, a sudden gust of wind swept through the valley, a whisper from the Great Spirit carrying him home. Far away, in cities and towns, his death made headlines. Newspapers across the United States printed his name in bold letters. Sitting Bull, the great Sioux chief, is dead. But the words that followed were mixed. Some called him a savage, others called him a hero. One reporter wrote, "He was the last great Indian, proud, defiant, and brave. For the white world, his death marked the end of an era, the last chapter of what they called the Indian Wars. For his people, it was the loss of their heartbeat. The day he died, something in the spirit of the plains shifted. 2 weeks later, at a place called Wounded Knee Creek, U.S. soldiers surrounded a Lakota camp performing the ghost dance. Tension snapped, and within minutes, gunfire filled the air. When it was over, hundreds of Lakota men, women, and children lay dead in the snow. The soldiers called it a battle. The world would later call it what it truly was, and does, massacre. It was as if Sitting Bull's death had opened the final wound, the last act in a tragedy that had begun the moment the treaties were broken, but his people did not let his memory die. They told their children about him, about the boy named Tatanka Iyotaki, who became a warrior not for conquest, but for love of his land. They spoke of his calm strength, his vision, his faith. They remembered how he faced every trial without fear. At night, the elders would point to the stars and say, "There he walks now, the great chief." Among the spirits of the buffalo, years passed. The world moved on. Railroads crossed the plains. Cities rose where once there had been grass and silence. But in the heart of every Lakota, Sitting Bull's name still lived. In the 1890s, photographs of him began to appear. His steady eyes, his braids, his eagle feathers. The world saw the face of the man they had once feared. He became more than a warrior. He became a legend. Artists painted him. Writers wrote his story. Some changed it. Some misunderstood it. But his truth remained. He had not fought for power. He had fought for the right to live free. In the early 1900s, the government moved his remains to a new grave near Mobridge, South Dakota, on a hill overlooking the Missouri River. The people said his spirit would watch over the plains forever. Even then, there were whispers that his bones had never truly rested. Some believed his spirit still wandered, searching for the home he had lost. Others believed he had become part of the land itself. As time passed, historians began to see him differently. They began to understand that Sitting Bull was not the enemy of progress. He was the voice of balance. He had said once, "Let us put our minds together and see what life we can make for our children." Those words, once ignored, began to echo again, in classrooms, in speeches, in books. Native leaders in the 20th century would quote him as a symbol of strength and identity. Activists carried his name into movements for justice and rights. His image appeared on murals, coins, and statues. The man who had died as a rebel was now remembered as a hero. And yet among his descendants, the wound of his death still lingered. They still told the story, how he was betrayed by his own people, forced by hunger, cornered by fear, how he had stood tall until his final breath. For the Lakota, he was not just history, he was blood, memory, and spirit. In ceremonies today, when the drums beat and the songs rise, his name is still spoken. The rhythm of the drums is said to carry his heartbeat, and when the wind sweeps across the Dakotas, through the tall grass and over the rivers, the old ones say you can still hear his voice, soft, steady, full of courage. It says, "Remember who you are," because Sitting Bull's story was never about one man. It was about a people, their endurance, their faith, their will to live. He was a man who saw beyond the wars, beyond the suffering, beyond the hunger. He saw a future where his people would rise again, not with weapons, but with wisdom, and today, more than a century later, that vision lives on. Every time a Lakota child learns the old language, every time a drum beats under an open sky, every time a voice says, "We are still here," Sitting Bull lives again. He is the whisper in the wind, the strength in the silence, the soul of a nation that refused to disappear. Years had passed since the sound of gunfire echoed through Standing Rock. The plains were quieter now, but they remembered. Every breeze that swept across the tall grass carried whispers of the past, of buffalo herds, of sacred songs, of the man who had stood against an empire. Sitting Bull was gone, but his spirit was everywhere, in the hearts of the Lakota. He was not a ghost, he was a guide. His story was told around campfires in schools and at powwows. Grandparents would lift their grandchildren onto their laps and say, "Listen, this is the story of the man who refused to kneel." They spoke of his courage, his wisdom, and his dream, that his people might live in harmony once more, free and proud. For many years, the U.S. government tried to erase that dream. They tried to write history in their own words, painting Sitting Bull as a rebel or a savage. But truth has a way of surviving, even when buried, and the truth of Sitting Bull began to rise again. In the early 1900s, photographs of him, his deep, steady eyes, his strong face began to spread. People who had once feared him now looked at those images with awe. Here was a man who had stood his ground when the world turned against him. Writers began to tell his story, not as a warning, but as a lesson. They wrote of his strength, his faith, his vision. Slowly, Sitting Bull became a symbol, not of rebellion, but of resistance, across Native communities. His name became a spark of pride. Young Lakota men and women began to say, "We are the people of Sitting Bull." Those words carried power, a reminder that they came from warriors, from dreamers, from survivors. As time moved on, the world began to change. The same country that once hunted him began to honor him. Historians started calling him what he truly was, a statesman, a philosopher, a man of peace. His quotes appeared in books and speeches. His wisdom was studied in universities. He had once said, "Let us put our minds together and see what life we can make for our children." That line became a message for generations. Artists painted his portrait, his long braids, his feathers, his eyes that seemed to see through time. Sculptors carved his face into stone, capturing his calm strength. Musicians sang his name in songs of pride and remembrance. And in the 20th century, as the Native American rights movement began to rise, his spirit rose with it. During the 1960s and 70s, when Native people across America began to demand justice, they carried his image on banners and flags. They shouted his name at protests. He had become the face of survival, proof that Native nations could not be erased. At Standing Rock, the same place where he had lived and died, young leaders began to organize. They spoke of unity, of protecting the land, of honoring the ancestors. They said, "Sitting Bull still walks with us." Even the U.S. government, the same force that once feared him, began to recognize his greatness. Schools, parks, and highways were named after him. His image appeared on stamps and coins, but for the Lakota, his memory was not something carved in stone or printed on paper. It lived in their blood. Each year, at powwows and gatherings, his songs were sung again. The drums beat in rhythm with his heartbeat. Dancers moved in circles, their feet brushing the same earth he had once walked. The elders said, "When we dance for Sitting Bull. We dance for every one of our ancestors who refused to die in silence." In 1953, his remains were moved from his original resting place near Fort Yates to a new grave near Mobridge, South Dakota, on a hill overlooking the Missouri River. There, a monument was built in his honor. It faced the rising sun, the symbol of hope and rebirth. Visitors came from across the world to pay their respects. They brought tobacco, feathers, and prayers. Some left in silence. Others wept. For even in death, Sitting Bull's presence was powerful, his spirit as strong as the wind over the plains. Over time, his story reached far beyond the borders of his homeland. Around the world, people saw in him something universal, the eternal fight for freedom, for dignity, for truth. He became a symbol not only for Native Americans, but for anyone who stood against oppression. His life was proof that one person, guided by courage and faith, could stand against the might of an empire and still win the respect of history. Today, when people speak of Sitting Bull, they no longer speak only of battles and wars. They speak of vision, leadership, and peace. He was a warrior, yes, but more than that, he was a teacher, a dreamer, a man who saw beyond his time. In a world still struggling with division and greed, his words ring louder than ever. The earth is our mother. Whatever befalls the earth befalls the sons of the earth. Those words, spoken more than a century ago, now echo through classrooms, documentaries, and movements for the planet's protection. Sitting Bull's message, once ignored, has become a guide for a world that has forgotten how to listen to the earth. And so, his legacy continues, not as a memory of the past, but as a voice for the future. Every time a Native child learns their language, every time a song is sung in Lakota, every time a protest rises to protect the land, Sitting Bull lives again. Because legends do not die. They return, in stories, in hearts, in the beating of the drum. The man who once stood against soldiers now stands with generations. His eyes still look toward the horizon. His spirit still whispers to the wind, and if you stand in the plains at sunset and listen closely, you might just hear his voice, soft, steady, and proud. The land is sacred. The people are strong. Remember who you are. Time moves on. Empires rise and fall. But the spirit of a true leader never fades. More than a century after Sitting Bull's death, his voice still echoes across the plains, across classrooms, museums, and hearts. The world he once knew has changed. The buffalo no longer roam the open plains. The iron tracks of trains stretch where grass once danced in the wind. Yet, in the quiet moments, when the wind blows through the Dakotas, it still carries his name. Sitting Bull. To the Lakota people, he is not just a memory. He is a heartbeat, a pulse that connects the past to the present. Every year, children in Native schools learn his story. Teachers speak of his courage, his vision, and his dream of unity. They tell how he stood for his people when no one else would, how he faced armies, hunger, and betrayal, but never bowed his head. For young Native Americans growing up in today's world, Sitting Bull has become more than history. He is identity. He reminds them that they come from warriors, thinkers, and dreamers, not victims. He reminds them that their voices matter, their culture matters, their land matters across North America. Murals of Sitting Bull appear on walls, his deep, unflinching eyes staring out across the concrete cities of the modern world. Beneath his image are words like, "Still here," "Honor the earth," "We are the future." Those words are not just slogans. They are promises, echoes of what Sitting Bull fought for. His spirit can be felt in every Native movement that rises today. When tribes stand to protect their sacred lands, when elders speak out for clean water, when young activists march to preserve their languages and traditions, they are walking in his footsteps. In 2016, at Standing Rock, the very place where Sitting Bull once lived and died, thousands of people gathered to protest the Dakota Access Pipeline. They called themselves water protectors. They came from every corner of the world, Native and non-Native, united by one belief, that the earth must be protected. The campfires burned through the cold nights. and the sound of drums filled the air. It was as if the spirit of Sitting Bull had returned to stand among them. Many elders said, "He is here. He walks with us again," and maybe he did, for the struggle was not new. It was the same fight he had led more than 100 years earlier. The fight for land, for dignity, for the right to live in harmony with the earth, even in art and media. Sitting Bull's presence remains strong. He has been portrayed in films, books and documentaries, some true, some twisted, some trying to capture his soul. In Hollywood, he was once shown as a villain, but now filmmakers and historians are reclaiming his truth. Modern storytellers show the man behind the legend, not a savage warrior, but a wise leader, a poet, a father, a man who dreamed of peace. Museums now display his artifacts, his pipe, his clothing, his photographs. But for the Lakota, his spirit cannot be locked behind glass. It lives in the songs, in the ceremonies, in the stories told under open skies. At universities, his words are studied in classes about leadership and philosophy. Students read his speeches and are surprised by their depth. They realize that his ideas about respect for nature, for equality, for peace, were far ahead of his time. He said, "The white man knows how to make everything, but he does not know how to distribute it." More than 100 years later, those words still ring true. In a world divided by wealth and greed, even outside of native communities, Sitting Bull's legacy inspires millions. Environmental movements quote him. Peace organizations honor him. Civil rights activists see him as proof that one voice, rooted in truth, can change the course of history. He reminds the world that real strength is not found in weapons, but in wisdom. That victory is not about conquering others, but about standing firm for what is right. And in the digital age, an age of screens and noise, his calm, timeless message cuts through like a whisper from the wind. Be patient, be strong. The earth will remember you. In schools, young artists paint his face. In powwows, dancers move to the rhythm of his heartbeat. In speeches, leaders invoke his name. Sitting Bull is no longer bound to one time or one nation. He belongs to every person who dares to stand for truth. He is the voice of resistance and hope, the living symbol that freedom is not given, it is earned, defended and carried forward, and still, somewhere in the plains, his story continues to unfold. On quiet evenings in the Dakotas, when the wind moves gently through the grass, you can still imagine him, the old chief, standing tall, his face toward the sunset. You can almost hear him whisper, "The land is my heart. My people are my soul." The fight for what is right never ends. And he is right, because Sitting Bull never really died. He became the land. He became the river. He became the voice that reminds us all to live with honor, to walk with respect, to never forget who we are. The wind never stops on the Dakota plains. It whispers through the grass, moves across the rivers, and dances over the old trails where horses once thundered. And if you listen closely, really listen, you can still hear his voice. The voice of Sitting Bull. A voice that spoke for freedom, for truth, for the heart of a people who refused to vanish. More than 100 years have passed since the day he fell, but his story still walks among us, not as history, but as a living lesson. He was born in a world of open skies and endless herds. He watched that world vanish before his eyes, yet he never surrendered his soul. He faced armies, betrayal, hunger, and exile, but he stood tall through it all. What makes Sitting Bull's story so powerful is not just what he fought against. It's what he stood for. He stood for honor. He stood for peace. He stood for the right of his people to live with dignity, to pray to their own God, to walk their own land, and to raise their children free. He believed that every person, no matter their color or nation, was a child of the Great Spirit. He said, "The earth is the mother of all people, and all people should have equal rights upon it." Those words were not written by politicians or kings. They came from a man who lived close to the earth, a man who saw truth not in books, but in the heartbeat of the land itself. Even when his enemies surrounded him, Sitting Bull never spoke with hatred. He spoke with wisdom. He said, "If a man loses everything but keeps his soul, he has lost nothing." It was that spirit, calm, fearless, and full of faith, that made him immortal. Today, the world is very different. The plains have cities. The buffalo have been replaced by highways. But the message Sitting Bull carried, that deep respect for the earth, for truth and for humanity, is more needed now than ever. He once warned, "The white man knows how to make everything, but he does not know how to share." More than a century later, those words still echo in a world divided by greed and power. His life teaches us something that modern leaders often forget, that real strength is not about domination. It's about compassion. He fought battles, yes, but his greatest victories were not on the battlefield. They were in the hearts of his people. He gave them hope when the world tried to take it away. He reminded them that identity cannot be erased, and even in defeat he won, because his spirit never broke. That is the secret of legends. They do not live forever in flesh, but in memory, in the stories that refuse to die. Every time a Lakota child learns to speak their language again, every time a drum beats beneath the open sky, every time someone stands up for what is right, Sitting Bull breathes again. He is not a man in the past. He is a spirit in the present. Across the world, people still draw inspiration from him. Teachers use his words to teach courage. Artists paint his image to remind us of resilience. Activists quote him when they speak for the earth, for peace, for justice. He has become a bridge between history and hope, between the old world and the new. For Native people, his story is a mirror, showing them who they were and who they still are. For the rest of the world, it is a lesson, a reminder that no empire, no nation, no power can silence truth forever. When Sitting Bull stood before the soldiers, before the crowds, before presidents, he was never afraid, because he knew that he was not standing alone. Behind him stood generations of ancestors, the strength of his nation and the voice of the Great Spirit. He had seen too much to fear death. He once said, "What is life? It is the flash of a firefly in the night. It is the breath of a buffalo in the winter. It is the little shadow which runs across the grass and loses itself in the sunset." Those words, soft, poetic, eternal, are his gift to the world. They remind us that life is brief, but meaning is everlasting. And when we live with truth, with kindness, with courage, our shadows never fade. So, when you think of Sitting Bull, do not think only of war or tragedy. Think of his smile when he spoke to children. Think of his calm when he prayed under the stars. Think of the strength it took to forgive, to lead, to love even in the face of destruction, because that is his true legacy, not the battle, but the balance. He taught that a warrior is not someone who kills. A warrior is someone who protects, and in that way, he is still protecting us, reminding every generation to honor the earth, to stand for what is right, and to walk with humility. If you close your eyes and feel the wind, you might sense him still, standing on a hill at sunset, his eagle feathers swaying in the breeze, his eyes watching the horizon, the same horizon where hope never dies. And if you listen carefully, you might hear his whisper, the final words of a man who lived and died for his people. Remember who you are. Stand strong, live in peace, and never forget the land that gave you life.